Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, one state offers lessons on how to cope with college enrollment. Jon Marcus of the Hechinger Report. Our questions this week, Mark continues his discussion with Lisa about ways to spot whether a college really wants test scores, even if they claim to be test optional or test flexible. That's part 2 of 2. Our interview is with Milyon Truelove, the VP and Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Reed College, on why Reed refuses to participate in U.S. News and World Report's college rankings. That's part 2 of 2.
Okay, friends. And if you notice, Dave sounds a little bit different. He's fighting a cold. He's fighting a cold. But Dr. Right. Lincoln Penny over here, the guy who pushed Lincoln off the penny, he's that tight, finally got rid of his 10-year-old computer, got a new laptop, and don't have a heart attack, listeners. He spent $500 on it.
That's right. It's actually a 24-inch Hewlett-Packard. It's nice. Yeah,
so if you got to notice a little bit different sound over there, so that's Dave over there. So, but appreciate him for being a trooper and fighting off a cold and persevering. Our admissions tip today comes from Rick in Indiana, and I was actually talking with Rick, and I asked him, "How are you guys doing? How's your family doing with the college process?" And he said to me, "We're doing really well because we're not letting ourselves get emotionally attached to any one school." And I said, "Ooh, that's good. Can I share that on the podcast?" He said, "Yes, you can." And so our tip comes from Rick in Indiana. Do not let yourself get emotionally attached to any one school. Great words of wisdom. And easier said than done, by the way. We're human. We're not robots. But it's still, if you can put yourself in that mentality, I always say put yourself in the mentality of a batter who's up to the plate, and you've got 12, however many schools are on your list, 12, 14, 15, 11, 8 chances to hit the ball. So big deal if you get a strike or a foul ball. Just stay calm because you still got another 10, 12 pitches coming your way. All right, our admissions vernacular. This is an easy one. I almost feel like quizzing Dave to cure up his sore throat there. So I can't remember between these two different ones here because my notes are not as great as they should be. I know I've given one, and I know I haven't given the other, so I'm just going to give them both, knowing that when I give them both, I'm covering the one that I didn't give already. Does that make any sense, Dave?
Yeah, I get you.
I'm throwing two out. So the terms are sweatshirt school and bumper sticker school. And I know I did one of them, and I know I didn't do the other one, so I'm just giving them both. So, Dave, I think you can answer this. What's a bumper sticker school or a sweatshirt school?
Bumper sticker gives out bumper stickers, and a sweatshirt gives out sweatshirts.
Okay, wise guy. Give you a layup, and you still fumble it.
Oh, I know. That sounded good.
So, obviously, this, it's considered sort of a brag school. Some people are highly motivated to have the bumper sticker on the car or the sweatshirt at the party. It's a status school. Doesn't mean it's a bad school. It might be the best fit for you, but that's a term for a school that's either a brag school that people are happy to brag about because it's prestigious, and sweatshirt school, bumper sticker school. And once again, all depends on your motives. If it's a good fit for you and it happens to be prestigious, then that's great. If you're doing it just to impress people, I think you need to question that process. So sweatshirt school, bumper sticker school, that's our word of the day. And because I don't remember which one I shared before, I'm giving them both to you. I got to get better with the notes here. All right. The big number is 87. And I think you guys know by now, when my numbers are under 100, it's probably percent, and that's what this is. So, this one's going to need a little bit of context. But a recent survey was done of 1,500 people by ZipRecruiter. And it asked people, do you regret the major you studied in college? And the highest number for people that regretted their major was 87%. Dave, one guess. What do you think it was?
Probably like art history or English.
The answer is journalism. Journalism.
Yeah.
You know, now here's where this gets tricky. I do not believe that means that someone who's passionate about journalism should say, okay, I guess I can't study journalism. It just means you need to really do some research, go in with your eyes wide open, and go in with a strategy. Of course, we know journalism has been completely upended by everything going to pay-per-clicks and social media, and if you went into journalism, think you were going to be a traditional print journalist and have everybody buy your paper, that whole field has just been completely upended. So I can understand why there's been some disillusionment there. And certainly there are a lot of journalists that do struggle to make a living. But once again, if you have a good strategy, you can take most majors and turn them into great opportunities, including art history. You just have to have a really good plan. You can't just sit back and think that the red sky, that the Red Sea's going to part and you're going to get recruited like you're LeBron James or something. Like, they just have to understand you're going to have to aggressively come up with a plan and strategically use your internships or co-ops.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right, well, we got a great article, so take it away, my friend.
Okay, this is by Jon Marcus as a Hechinger Report, and it's one state offers lessons on how to cope with the college enrollment crisis. And Maine has been dealing for a decade with the student decline now happening and everywhere. Well, first of all, it gives the story that 10 years ago, Maine had the highest median age in any state. And it had a 10% decline over the last 10 years in the number of new high school graduates. Yet, despite these daunting statistics, the University of Maine has managed to increase its undergraduate enrollment during that period by about 5%. And the state's community colleges are reporting near record applications. So the question of this article is, how have the institutions in Maine itself been able to do this? And it's by luring out-of-state students with in-state tuition prices and by breaking with long-standing attitudes which tended to alienate prospective students. So 10 years ago, University of Maine got 80% of its students within its state. But its supply of new students began to dramatically fall. So what Maine did was it basically did this huge change where it reworked its financial aid so that it would charge out-of-staters the same tuition as in-staters. And during that time, it actually put up billboards advertising, "Go to the University of Maine for the in-state cost of University of Massachusetts." Because of this very successful campaign, the proportion of out-of-state students doubled, and the overall enrollment increase brought in increased revenues that helped keep the tuition comparatively low. The other things that it did during this time is it enlisted everybody into the task of campus recruiting. You're going to have to bear with me, Mark. I'm losing my voice.
That's okay.
So it enlisted everybody in the task of campus recruiting. For example, since Orono, Maine is hard to get to, the athletics department would host prospective students at their away games. The alumni hosted high school retreats during homecoming weekend, and even the faculty got involved with prospective student recruiting. There was one story where the dean of the engineering actually took time out to tour a prospective engineering student around campus. And the other thing that it did was it got less selective. In 2014, the University of Maine accepted 83% of its students, but now it accepts 93% of its applications. But despite this very high acceptance rate, the proportion of students who drop out is lower than the national average. So by keeping the students it accepts and slightly increasing its acceptance rate, and by lowering prices for out-of-staters, it was able to dramatically increase its enrollment. Now, the Maine's community colleges also did some dramatic things during this time to maintain its enrollment. At the time, they put $60 million in state and private funding to add short-term training that students need to get or change jobs, and speeded up the time for credit course by offering more courses per week. The schools also forged agreements with 230 employers around the state to fast-track training for specific jobs. And in April, they made 2 years of community college free for full-time students, and that increased registrations up 171%. So, Mark, I'm actually going to turn this over to you shortly because my voice is about to go out. But looking ahead, in the next 15 years, high school graduates will drop by another 7% in Maine, 5% nationally. And despite that, Maine has responded by increasing its tuition to 8 to 10 weeks per year in states like Florida and Texas and other places where more high school students reside. And they have hired a Spanish-speaking admission officer. So, Mark, let me turn it over to you. Wow, my voice.
Before you sound more like a frog? Yeah. Hey, you get an A+ for effort, my friend. Good for being a trooper. So there's a lot of reasons why this article is appealing. You know, we talk a lot about college admissions. I sometimes think we don't talk enough about underlining demographic trends and how they're impacting the country very differently. So if you're in one of the really fast-growing states right now, like a Utah or an Idaho, North Dakota, Nevada, on the smaller side, but on the larger states growing really, really fast, Texas, Florida, Arizona, experiencing a lot of growth, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, experiencing a lot of growth, it's a completely different situation for you than if you're one of the states that is experiencing a lot of outmigration, a place like an Illinois or a West Virginia or a Mississippi or parts of New England and parts of the Midwest. It's completely different. And, I've quoted Scott Jasek a couple times. He said something once before, and he was primarily talking about private schools. But he said there's 3 tests you can look at to see whether a school is likely to be financially healthy. And the 3 tests that he gave were, what is the brand name of the school? What is the location of the school? In other words, is it in an attractive location? Attractive locations tend to be cities are hot, and so our college towns are hot. And even suburbs can be hot, but remote is not hot. And then the other thing he said was the endowment. And so he said, if you have all 3, you're probably doing extremely well as a school. If you have 2 of those 3, you're still probably doing well, but not as well as those who have all 3. If you have 1, you're probably really, really struggling. And if you have none, you're probably going to close or merge or downsize. You're just probably not going to make it. And so that was, I think, somewhat simplistic, but still a kind of a good rubric to look at schools from. But it primarily fits private schools. When you look at public schools, you have to slightly change the metrics a little bit, because public schools are not endowment reliant the way private schools are. So for public schools, you still need to look at location. It's still a really big factor. You still need to look at brand name. That's still a really big factor. But for public schools, I would argue there's 3 other things you need to look at. One is, what are your state appropriations? You know, if you're a state like Colorado, literally getting less than 5% of your money from your state, that can be challenging. But fortunately, Colorado's in a hot, growing state, so they were able to counter it with a gorgeous campus on the flagship, and Colorado State, doing some real good things as well. So state appropriations, in other words, how much money are you getting from your state toward education? Incredibly important. The other things you need to look at if you're a public school is your state experience in migration or out migration. And I mentioned, a second ago, some of the states that are growing really fast. I didn't mention all the fast-growing states. I mentioned some of the states that are really floundering. Didn't mention all of them, but you get the point. And the last thing that I would say is, are you being really strategic in both your price setting and in your recruitment? And so what you see in Maine is you see a state that's been struggling. It's been losing a lot of students. In fact, there's a quote from the article that I want to read here. The article refers to how difficult it is in Maine, especially in rural areas. And it says, here's a quote: "I can go to a high school and I can have 9 people come see me. And that's the whole senior class and half the juniors in the rural areas." So if you're in a place that's really experiencing real out-migration, that's going to be challenging. However, this is an encouraging story because it shows that while it may be challenging, there's still things you can do. And there's a lot of talk. Dave and I have talked a lot about, the demographic cliff and the demographic decline. There's all kinds of names out there for it right now. We've had many articles discussing it over the last probably 18 months or so. But this isn't the first time we've been here. 30 years ago, higher ed really went through a tremendous challenge as well, where less kids were going off to college and there was a decline. And the way higher ed survived then was they recruited their way out of it through using a lot more effective recruiting strategies. And Maine is an example of this. Maine is thriving now because they have come up with a number of strategic initiatives.
And can I say?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's a quote that I really love. This is a place that's recruiting from Florida, and this was their motto 10 years ago. It might be 10 below under 4 feet of snow, but no matter where we go, we love Orono.
Yeah. I was going to quote that one too, Dave. You beat me to it. That was a tough one for us weather weenies, man.
And you're going down to Florida.
Hey.
4 feet of snow, come to Florida.
Exactly. So you got to do what you got to do. And so, I want to share a couple of stories, and they'll relate back to this. I'm going to get a little more personal in this episode than probably I've been in a while, but hopefully I'll be able to make a point that will relate to this article. So I never shared the story before in terms of how did I get my job in boarding school admissions in 2001. Well, I know what those of you who listen regularly are thinking, well, you did college admissions, so I'm sure you just went in and used your college admissions credentials, and that got you in the door. It's actually not true. It was on my resume. But when I worked at Phillips College in Dallas, Texas, I only was there for a year, and the school actually closed. I mean, I'm still somewhat traumatized by my manager coming in, having a meeting, and saying we're going to be closing. Financially, we were just really struggling. So how good of an admission officer was I? So, it was on the resume, but I didn't talk about it that much. And that's one reason why I've been really always passionate about the finances, because I've seen what it's like working at an under-resourced school and working at a well-resourced school. I've been in both, and it's just night and day different. So how did I get in? Well, in the 10 years from 91 to 2001, I did 2 things. I did Christian ministry for 4 years, and I did outside business-to-business sales for 6, working at Fortune 500 companies. And then I got really involved in volunteering at the local school where my daughter was in pre-K at the time, my oldest. I got really involved in volunteering. So I was doing tours. I was following up with prospective families. I was volunteering in the admission office. But then they approached me and they said, we like your business skill set. You've got outside business-to-business sales experience in some of the leading Fortune 500 companies. And we think there's a correlation between sales and recruitment. And I bring that up to say that's a lot of what University of Maine did. They started using not slick Madison Avenue, tactics, but they just started using very, very effective recruiting tactics to turn their situation around. One of the things that Dave pointed to, they enrolled the whole school, got involved. It wasn't just the job of the admission office to do recruitment. They used the whole entire school. Here's another quote that I want to read from the article. So here's one quote from Jerome Lucido, Executive Director of the Center for Enrollment Policy Research and Practice at the University of South Carolina's Rozier School of Education, talking about Maine. They're taking care of their reality. The question is, will everybody else do that? And so what they did was they really got involved in utilizing the entire team. It doesn't mean everybody was over there reading files, but Dave talked about it. They'd have the head of civil engineering give you a tour when you showed up. They trained their people to go up and introduce yourself to new people, and then surveys showed that people found the place to be warm and friendly. And so they just did a number of initiatives to involve everybody. And another quote I like from the article, and this is sort of talking about the crisis that higher ed has nationally, and how a lot of people are just sort of tinkering on the edges and tweaking things around the edges. But the problem is going to become so chronic and so acute that, desperate times call for desperate measures. So here's a quote from Dagler. He says he isn't convinced universities in other states recognizes the problem they're up against. And then he says this: when I go out and I talk to colleagues nationally, I don't see the kinds of changes coming that we're making, he said. I hear people talking about tweaking around the edges. I don't think this is an environment where tweaking around the edges is going to work. So desperate times called for desperate measures. And then I want to share one other personal story, and then we'll kick off a little conversation. So I was at an admission conference in Naples, Florida, Dave, and this is probably this is within a year now. It was 2005 or 6, one of those two. And, after the conference is over and everything, a lot of people like to go out and have fun. And, this, Dave, I'm not a drinker. I'm not a partier, really. So I really wasn't into that scene. So I just decided to hang out. And I had the most intriguing conversation I've had in a long time. It was fascinating. I'll never forget it. What did I do? I spent 2 hours talking to the bellhop at the Ritz-Carlton. Now, this hotel where the conference was at had won America's top hotel for customer service 3 straight years in North America. These conferences, they tend to go to nice places. So I was just talking to him about the job. He would tell me these unbelievable stories. Like he told me, he's like, see that top suite up there? There's a guy that's been living there for 30 straight days at $4,000 a night. He would talk about how when I park somebody's car and they tell me what their favorite wine is, it's my job to have it on their bed by the time they get to their room. And he talked to me about how I make this call and this person delivers it and this, that, the other. And he said they give me a $2,000 slush fund.
$2,000 slush fund every day
to just make those kinds of decisions on the spot. But he was talking to me about what 5-star customer service is like. And I know that's probably taken to an extreme, but I thought about that when I read this article, and I read all the little touches that Maine was doing to make everybody feel really, really special. Now, the other thing that they did was they addressed the price issue. They addressed the cost issue. They realized, okay, we have a dying population here. There's only a limited number of people that we can possibly recruit. So we're going to go out of state. And so they created reciprocity with Massachusetts and surrounding states, meaning you get in-state tuition. And I'll tell you, Dave, they've continued to do really, really aggressive things. Some of them are not even in the article. During the height of COVID, they offered anybody in any 50 states an opportunity to come there and finish their degree off at in-state pricing. In the last month, they've got a new initiative, people coming back from any war. that never finish their education, no matter what state they're in, they can come to Maine and pay in-state pricing.
Another thing Maine did 7 years ago, as part of its flagship match program, qualified students from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania would be able to attend the University of Maine and pay the same tuition and fees as their flagship state school back home.
You talked about the fact that they are adding regional recruiters in high population areas like Florida and Texas to recruit those markets. And these are the kinds of things that schools have to do. And then, of course, on their community college, they offered community college for free. And they really surveyed their employers in the area to find out what skills do you need. And then they customized some of their offerings toward the needs. Like, Dave, do you want to talk about, was it surgical tech? It was in your field. The article talked about a surgical tech position. Or are you struggling over there too much, man? You need to take a pass on this.
It's frustrating because actually I'm trying to speak, but it's just coming out. I'm going to sound like Howard the Duck.
It's all right. We'll give you a pat. You get an A+ for effort.
Work is magic on this one.
Yeah. Manuel earned his pay on the editing.
Yeah, the two things I thought was impressive was Maine is a very rural state. And so they talked about how they actually had classes that they would go into the rural areas and have in-person classes in rural areas so that people would have greater accessibility, even though they weren't near the main campus. They focused on things like nursing, and there was one, how to become a surgical technician. Those are the people that actually assist surgeons in operations and so forth. And they had a program in which you could be out in 16 months, which is quite impressive. And a surgical technician can make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 in certain situations. So, when you
that's pretty good for 16 months of education.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, of course, what they also did is they stressed that not all states that have gone tuition free have been successful in increasing their community college enrollment. They looked at Tennessee and it did not. But Maine also had a subsequent advertising program in which not only did it go tuition free, but it emphasized to kids the disparity in lifetime earnings between people who had some community college education and those that did not. So they really made the point, this is free and this is really going to help you because in 16 months, you could have a skill that you could raise a family and have a great life. And you could stay in rural Maine, but without it, you're going to have no job opportunities whatsoever. And I think as a result of that, their registration soared up 171%. So quite impressive.
Yeah, and the reason why I gave the sales story is because sometimes in education, you can get fat and sassy because you're getting a salary no matter what you do. And when you compare that to sales positions, I mean, I always had salary base and commission, but some sales positions, like take real estate or something, it's straight commission. Like you either produce or you don't get anything. Like it forces you to have to really be innovative and not be fat and sassy. And what's happening now with schools is they're realizing either because of demographic decline, other things we've talked about, like cost of college being a deterrent, all these other jobs having to pay, with people not wanting to go back to work since they liked working at home and it's been difficult for employers to hire. They've had to pay more. It's been harder for colleges to attract kids if they can get a $20 an hour job right out of high school working for Amazon or something. What it's doing is it's forcing schools to have to show the same level of innovation like a sales rep who knows, like, I'm as good as my last sale, and if I don't produce, then I can look elsewhere. And it's forcing that level of creativity and that level of innovation. And if you get creative and you get innovative, there's things that you can do. And so Maine just presents as a compelling example. Like, what are the issues? Well, the issues are, one, we don't have enough people. So how can we expand our pool? Well, we'll expand our pool by going national. Cost is a concern, so we're going to have to address our cost structure. So we do that. Okay, people are questioning the ROI. Okay, let's tighten up our research. They actually talked about the article, like they did research to show what jobs they were producing that were producing higher wage earners. And then they had a marketing campaign to show, look at the average salaries for our graduates in these fields compared to national competition. And so you tighten up your offerings so that people can see the ROI. And you can in most instances, you can recruit your way out of a bad situation. Now, some situations are just so bleak that you probably are going to end up having to merge, close, or downsize. But I just thought the article presented a compelling example of some of the type of creativity and innovation that is going to happen to avoid more mergers, closures, and downsizing.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts?
Well, looking ahead, I thought was interesting because what they basically said is, as well as we've done, we're still looking in they basically said, the fact is, all the colleges, once they actually figure out what we have already figured out, it's just going to make the competition for these students that much worse. So, they're doing all the right things. When you have Maine spending 10 weeks a year with recruiters in Florida and Texas, when they have people learning how to speak Spanish, and when they're actually trying to, now they had a point, many institutions are not financially structured to give out immediate in-state tuition. That would be such a hit to their bottom line that they'd have to do massive layoffs. So they're way ahead on that one because they've already gone through that. But they recognize that they're going to have to continue to innovate in order to make this happen.
Yeah, and the idea of going to the regional recruiter and then having your school offer generous out-of-state merit scholarships, that's not new. Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, these schools have almost perfected that. Some of them have 40-plus regionals all around the country. And it makes sense. Send an Alabama recruiter to work the Chicago market. They don't pay them that much. Their salaries are really bleak. They're making $50,000. I know that there's benefits and things like that. So let's say your whole package, everything's an $80,000 package by the time you count everything. How many students do you need to bring in from Chicago at out-of-state tuition to justify that cost? Not that many, right? You have to look at your actual cost to deliver the education. But if one person is bringing in 15 students, it's easily covering their costs. So that model's been going on for a long time. I think what's unique about this is, and I think you're going to see a lot more of this, which is more reciprocity agreements, because they created reciprocity in neighboring states, right? Because let's face it, you're going to be more likely to get somebody from Massachusetts to go to Maine than somebody from Atlanta, Georgia. But there's a market out there. Like, there's people you can sell your skiing. You sell what you have. You work with what you have. You work with your natural resources. And big enough states, you get people that used to live in certain areas and they have connections to certain areas, or you get specialized programs. We heard from University of West Florida a few weeks ago talking about their cybersecurity, talking about their marine biology, and they're offering, hey, you can be right on the ocean and you can have good marine biology and good cybersecurity. So you do what you need to do. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this because you brought up a good point, Dave. We're not out of the weeds yet.
Yeah.
You're not out of the weeds yet at all. The next 5 years, there's going to be a lot more demographic declension. So we'll continue to come back to this topic. It's an important one. Go get some medicine, man. Rest up. Fix your frog voice, man. I can take frog voice one time, but I don't want this to be the new Dave.
Oh, no. Oh, boy.
Are you coming off the evening shift or not?
No, I've actually had a couple days off. I've actually been sick for the last couple days. It's like I spent the whole day in bed, actually last couple days. I think I have even though I got a flu shot, it's very typical that early in the season, I usually get sick. Then I recover and then I'm immunized. But
Sure.
Whatever is going on, I definitely had it.
All right. Well, we're going to let you go rest up.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, last week you heard the first part. Now it's time for the second part. All right, point number 6. Take note when there's a very high percentage of students that are submitting tests. Now, you can get all this information. You can go to College Navigator and go to the admissions tab, and it'll show you the percentage of people that submitted an SAT or an ACT. And you'll see those numbers are all over the place. Like, I've looked at them, and for a school like a Boston University, don't quote me on, but I believe it was at 38%. But then for Princeton, it was 90%.
Wow.
So the more you're a total outlier by not submitting, the more it just invites more scrutiny to your application. Now, don't get me wrong. People still get admitted without test scores. And the reason why this is tricky, because, Lisa, I don't want people coming away from this thinking, oh, I got to submit test scores to all my schools. That is not true. I saw people last year admitted at some of the most selective schools in the country without test scores. I'm talking about students often coming from well-resourced schools admitted without test scores. Because there was enough other stuff in the file. Really strong curriculum, really good grades, really good teacher comments, and usually some other form of other testing. Now, I lied. I said I had one more to read. I have a third. I have one more to read. One more test flexible example. And this is NYU. All right, here we go. Due to COVID-19, NYU has modified its testing requirements to 2023. We have extended our test optional policy due to COVID-19 for the 2022-2023 year. Once again, 1 year extension, not 2. They haven't said anything about 2024. That's a telltale sign. Students who elect to submit testing as part of their application, NYU has one of the most flexible testing policies. Okay, so now we've got another test flexible, basically, similar to Purdue and Auburn, right? Although one thing that I want to note, just because you're test flexible, don't think, oh, I know what that is. You still need to read the details. Auburn's test flexible was different than Purdue's test flexible. NYU's test flexible is different from Auburn's and different from Purdue's. I know people are like, why is this so confusing? Those are their individual schools. They can do what they want. So listen to what NYU says about their test flexible policy. If you choose to submit standardized test scores, you only need to submit one form of testing. We will review the form of testing that you indicate you would like on your application. What are your options below? Okay, SAT must be taken within 5 years of the date of application and sent directly from the College Board. ACT must be taken within 5 years and sent directly from the ACT. Okay, 3 advanced placement exams. If you wish to apply with 3 AP exam results, we require 1 from a humanities exam, 1 from a math or a science exam, and 1 from an exam of your choice. So you need to submit at least 3 AP exams, 1 humanities, 1 math or science, and then the third you can pick. And then it says you will find a list of which exams fall into these categories below on this page. The exam must be taken prior to the date of your application. IB or International Baccalaureate, they take HL or higher level exams. For non-diploma students who wish to apply with 3 higher level predictions or final results, we require 1 from humanities, 1 math or science, and 1 from one of your choice. And so basically they'll take IB or AP, and then they'll also take A-level predictive scores from students that have had A-level exams. And then some schools, I think it might be NYU, they'll let you present the AMY math scores if you have that. Let's see. Maybe it's here. Oh, we also accept a number of other exams and qualifications from around the world. And it goes on to say some of that. So there we go. Any thoughts at all, Lisa, on that, on all the test flexible options?
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem that flexible to me. I mean, not every kid is going to have access to 3 APs by their junior year. I don't know. It just seems like it's basically saying submit the scores.
Well, here's where I disagree a little bit. Like, I have found, when I look at the kids, I took a look last year at kids that got in without SAT or ACT scores. And this is just my experience, but they had another form of standardized testing that showed that they did well on that type of test.
Normally it was AP because that's the most common of all of these. I have found that a lot of schools have informally gone from test optional to test flexible on the more competitive levels. In other words, if I'm working with a family and they do not have SAT or ACT scores to submit, and if they've taken a bunch of APs, a lot of kids take 3 or 4 APs junior year. Some kids have taken, just depends on, the school and the kid. Some kids have taken like 6. And if they don't have good scores there, that's a tough sell. Like you don't want to submit your APs or your SATs or your ACTs. Like there are plenty of schools that would love to have you if you're a good kid and a good student and you have good grades and grade trends and grade patterns and all that. But not if you're shooting for the most selectives.
Yeah.
That's just a really tough sell. No AC, no ACT, no SAT, and you don't want to. And they can see you've taken 6 APs, and they know that you're coming from a well-resourced school, and they know that most of the kids from your school submit your scores, and now you're not turning in any of your 6 APs or your SAT and ACT. When I have that situation, I'm generally telling people that we need to readjust our expectations for where you're going to be competitive.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because the other meeting I went to at the school this week was that they're getting rid of APs, which is, I think, a trend that's happening at a lot of private schools. And the parents were worried and upset that this was going to affect their kids in college admissions. So it's interesting to hear you say that, people are looking at AP scores in lieu of that. Now, I don't know what schools will do if there are no APs to take at your school anymore. But it's just interesting.
I was in admissions in 2007 when we did that at Westtown. And Susan was one of the ones pushing for it because at the time we had APs in math and science and we had advanced classes in English and history. And that's because the student teachers wanted to use their own creativity. They felt they could go beyond the AP and do more advanced work. For example, our U.S. history teacher, you'd go down into the archives and do 2 weeks of original research like you would generally do in grad school. And so it was like more advanced than the AP. But the problem was the admission, and Susan could talk about this, the admission officers were reading our curriculum like we were a math science school. And they were saying, oh, you kids have a lot of math science, but then they don't have a lot of AP. So she largely drove the push saying we need to use the same nomenclature across the board. And so we went to using it term advanced for everything. And a lot of schools had done it before, Phillips Andover, Exeter, Fieldston. Some of them had done it in 2001. But I was furious at the time because I thought it was going to make it really hard for me to recruit. And it did not end up hurting our kids at all. Susan was right. I was wrong. And since then, it's not going away. But you do find it more selective schools. Like we did a podcast episode a while ago. All 6 of very prominent schools in the Metro DC area all took the plunge all at one time, maybe last year or the year before, and they all dropped APs. Colleges don't care if you're coming from a school like where your kids are at because they know that it's advanced level work.
Now, I know if Julia were here, she would say, we dropped APs at Milton, and most of our kids don't take AP tests at all, and they do just fine in their college placement. So taking the AP tests without scores looks worse if it's the norm for your students at your school to take the AP.
Now, here's where it can hurt you. If you're counting on saving some money by getting an AP score and coming in with college credit.
Right.
But you know what we found is that kids can still do well on those scores. Sometimes you need to get a tutor and you need to have somebody cover some of the material that maybe wasn't the same. But generally, those kids are still getting 4s and 5s on APs, even without, just because it's going to be a lot more advanced work, and it allows the teachers to be more creative, and they can have more depth and not just skim the surface and not have as much critical thinking. How did your parents react to that?
Well, there were a lot of, so they presented this to the 9th and 10th grade parents, and the 9th grade parents were just like, whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
The 10th grade parents were upset. And I think they're upset because some of the 10th graders were taking APs this year and some weren't. And they were afraid that colleges were going to look more favorably upon the kids who took the APs versus the kids who just didn't happen to take the APs. So, and your friend from the admissions office kept trying to calm everybody down. But I think with,
Yeah, because he could say I've read lots of schools without it. Trust
Right.
me.
It's
Yeah.
fine. But I don't think they were entirely convinced. So, and then there was just some concern about, cost. Like, because if you go to
Sure.
UNC Chapel Hill, they accept APs. And so you could get, several classes that you don't have to pay for. Whereas I think if you go to some place like Duke or, one of these more competitive private schools, they don't accept very many of the APs anymore.
Correct.
So,
UNC's got a real flexible policy. So do a
Right.
lot of public schools, more so than privates. Now, here's what I'll say, just once again to bring in the right nuance. I'll actually bring this up with Julia the next time we record, which is coming up shortly. Milton has gotten rid of APs. And she will say that there are some schools that do not know how to properly read their transcript. So, like, most schools that really read well holistically will make that adjustment. But in fairness, you are a little bit at the mercy that a school knows how to really read a transcript well if you're coming from a school without APs. And in general, what my experience is that sometimes some of the public state schools are some of the ones that ding you the most.
Yeah, especially because so many other schools, like the public schools in our state, are very AP heavy. So if Sonia had gone to public school this year, she would have been taking 1 or 2 APs this year and like 5, for subsequent years, because that's just how they do it in those schools. So, I mean, it's a very different looking transcript. They said that they had polled every school that had come to visit this year and asked them if it would make a difference. And everybody said, no, it wouldn't. We'd be fine with it, except for Tulane. Tulane was like, nope, sorry, we're going to ding your kids if you don't have APs. So
yeah, most private schools are not only are they fine with it, they're really used to it now. Like it was 2007 when we did it.
Right.
That's 15 years ago, and it was fine for us. I think 2001 was the first time I heard somebody really moving away from it was Philston in New York. So this is what I would say for anyone else who's out there. We're kind of going off topic, but hopefully this is valuable. So here's what you should do. So I could tell you this off the record, Lisa, but I'm sure others might want to hear. What you want to do is take the subject area where your child is strongest areas. So let's say Sonia's really strong in like English history or whatever. And then you want them to talk to the teacher that's like teaching that advanced class that they take. And ask them, what areas did you deviate from the AP? Because probably the person has taught the AP before.
Right.
And you want to say, what areas did you not cover that would have been covered in an AP? And then you either want to get a tutor to supplement that. One thing that Weston did that really helped was our teachers put on like some instructional sessions to go over material that for those who want to take the AP, that they didn't cover because they covered other things with more depth. If you do that, you can still go in and score well on the test. And it's actually impressive to score well on the test when you weren't even in an AP exam. You weren't even in an AP course and you still took an AP test and did well. And believe it or not, kids really still do well on those tests, that especially some of the classes where the content doesn't deviate that much from the AP.
Right. Like I think like math, for instance. Math is math.
Yes. Like I know for us, if I remember correctly, chemistry stuck pretty close to the AP. When they changed and no longer did that, biology was quite different. So it can depend a little bit on what the professors decide to do. But I'll tell you what, your faculty is going to love it because it gives them a lot more creativity. Like you might have a faculty who's like a complete specialist as a geneticist. Maybe they got their PhD or something in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can really go in depth into an area like that. The problem with the AP is it's got more depth, more breadth than depth.
Right. It's
so
very
you
fast.
it's super fast and you just keep skimming the surface and covering all this content, but you don't really get into it and with the level of depth. So I know 15 years later, looking back, like Westtown, nobody has any issues with it because they found out that schools learn to interpret our transcripts pretty well and the kids do well. But I'll talk with Julia about this on here as well, because I know we talk and sometimes she'll say that such and such school, it's usually a public school, they don't get our kids. Like places like UGA
Or Clemson or UConn.
they'll ding you. they're so used to reading APs. And by the way, I've noticed that private schools have a little bit of a bias toward private and public have a bit of a bias toward public. It's just, anyway, I'm getting off topic. All right, my last points. Look at the scholarships. Do the scholarships require test scores, or are test scores, certainly are they required for the best scholarships that the school offers? That's a telltale sign that they love test scores. And then the last thing is, and this one you can't always get, but sometimes you can. Some schools revealed this. About 30 schools revealed this last year. What was their admit rate for their test submitters versus their non-test submitters? What is the admit rate? Now, the part that's tricky about that is kids that don't submit test scores usually also don't have the same GPA or the same curriculum. So you can't just say, oh, this school admitted 38% with test scores and only 31 without test scores. So C proves it. Test scores advantage. It's really tricky because the research would show that the people that didn't submit test scores also have lower GPAs and less rigor and worse grade trends, right? And so it's tricky. But when I see a really big difference, like sometimes I saw some differences that were substantial, like double admit rate differences. There were really big differences this year from places like Emory and Penn and Davidson. They were pretty significant. And if I see like more than a 50% difference in admit rate between the test submitters and the non-submitters, I think that's significant.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, if you're a student athlete applying to an academic D3 or academic D1 school, it is not uncommon for them to want and expect test scores for their athletic recruits.
Thoughts on this topic? I feel like I'm been doing more talking than listening.
This is really helpful. And I just think you make this point in a lot of different contexts, but I feel like read the language of the school, whether it's submission statement or their test optional policy, or, the things that they say in their supplemental essays. I'm sorry, their college specific essays.
You listened to my last podcast.
Of course. So, I think that just to really read that carefully, I always say that people tell you who they are a lot of times, especially if they're going to do something bad to you. Like the first 10 minutes you meet them, they'll telegraph that to you. And I think the schools are also going to tell you what they want. They're not going to just say it directly, but if you read between the lines a little bit, you'll be able to better discern what their preferences are.
Yeah, it's just an interesting time right now because the first few years, schools really could say that the pandemic kept people from taking the test. Now you can't really say that anymore. And so now, you really don't know, is the school test optional because they really, truly, strongly believe that they can evaluate an applicant without scores and they can make great decisions without it and there's no bias at all? Or are they doing it because their competitors are doing it and they're not afraid, they don't want to lose those applications? I found it really interesting when the University of North Carolina decided to go test optional for 2023. They flat out came out and said, we think we'd be putting our schools at a disadvantage, talking about the state schools, when a lot of the other schools that our kids are going to look at are not offering test scores. And I respected their transparency, but I also noted it because that's a different motivation. It's like, I really wish we could require them, but I don't want to lose 20% of our applications.
Yeah. And I think that, with the UNC system, the schools are really diverse because when I visited App State, they were like, we would love to never take a test score again, but it's not up to us. Where maybe UNC, Chapel Hill, or maybe NC State is like, we would like some test scores, please. We find those to be useful. So, but everything is standardized across the entire system. So the schools don't kind of get to pick and choose.
Correct. And I'm actually really glad you brought that point up because this is an important point that does need to be emphasized. There are so many colleges that are so happy to be test optional, so many admission officers. They love not having to look at scores. They love it. I attended a presentation at Georgia State about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they were just giddy. I met with their honors college did a presentation, and they said that our honors college is now 1/3 Black, 1/3 white, 1/3 South Asian, and we love it. We've kind of always wanted it to be this way. And this flexibility, being able to look at other factors, has given us the diversity that we've always wanted to have. So, and I can't tell you how many admission officers say it's such a joy to read without test scores. Part of it is because they know test scores bias them. It's really hard to unsee a bad number. If you're like reading this file and, if you're a school and you typically take kids, let's say your average ACT's at 28, your average SAT's at 1350, and you're reading these essays and everything and you just love it, and then bang, you see 21. It's like you can't get that out of your head and it completely biases you. And they don't like that bias. That's why Lisa Prescott, when I interviewed her, been at UCSB, Santa Barbara, 35 years before the UCs made the decision to go test blind. She said her and her staff were leaning toward not factoring scores in, as a team, because she says, I don't know if we can handle seeing them.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's the strongest reason to be test optional personally. I do think there's some value to scores, but it's like my biggest problem with scores is that they have undue influence more than they should, because you've heard me say this, numbers do voodoo on the brain.
Right. Well, it's so interesting too with the entire state of California public system, which is huge, being test blind. I wonder what people are going to do with all those California students. Are they going to understand why they don't have scores? Because maybe they're not offering them in their schools, or they're less available or not emphasized? Or are they going to, is Yale going to say, yeah, you need to send me?
Well, this is one of the reasons why I strongly do believe that you're not going to all of a sudden see massive amounts of schools change their test optional policy as California.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Heath Einstein, I don't think we talked about this on the podcast, but I've heard him say this when he was on from TCU. He's like, 15% of all of our kids come from California, and we noticed way less California residents submit scores. You probably know this, Lisa. We have kids that we work with that still find it hard to take a test in California. It's not that they can't do it, but as soon as they went test optional, then less places started offering it. Test blind. And, I'm in 2 different college counseling groups, 3 actually. You're in 2 of them. One of them is just all of our little podcast past team here, the 6 to 8 of us. We have a little mini group, but we have our own group that we started, and then another group that I'm in. And the other 2 groups have at least 5 to 7 California college counselors in them. And they still say that it can be difficult getting a test out here for kids, especially if you're not if you're more well-resourced, then if you need to hop a plane or somewhere, you can do it. Or if you need to, go 400 miles, it's not a problem. So I am not saying that all of a sudden everybody's going to go back to requiring the test. I don't see that happening at all. It wouldn't surprise me if Yale made the decision. It'll be interesting. I think if you see any movement to go back to it, it's going to come from one of the super elites.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might see some stuff like for a super competitive major might do something like that. But for the most part, I don't see that because of all the reasons we talked about, like the competitors and the fact that they're getting so many applicants from places that they've always wanted to get them. But you can kind of have your cake and eat it too if you stay test optional, but sort of show that you have a preference. And that's what I'm seeing more of. And that's what I want people to be aware of. And probably if you only remember one of the 8 points, just go read the language very carefully.
Go read the language. Yeah. It's a little depressing, quite honestly, because I know just what a strain testing puts on kids and families, emotionally and financially and intellectually. So to hear that colleges are kind of signaling that that's what they want, I think is going to push people to do it.
Yeah, I still contend that if you can show some testing in other ways, that's good. There's no doubt in my mind, AP exams in junior year count more than they did before in this test optional environment. Schools like to have a standardized benchmark in the file. So maybe what you do is you put a little, effort into getting some tutoring for an AP. Sometimes it's easier to do well on an AP. It's just so content-based with tutoring.
Yeah, I think the problem is that they were saying that they didn't even know if they were going to be able to offer the APs at at the school anymore. And so that's another reason why parents were upset, because like if you could maybe take them at the public school if they have room, but they never have room. So where do you even get the test? And I think there's an idea that the AP might go online for some of the subjects in the next year or two, but that hasn't been announced yet.
That wouldn't surprise me because the College Board's going online for, well, I mean, I won't say online, but yeah, basically online. I mean, online in a test center, right? Everyone is very pleased with that, by the way. I haven't come back from the conference, like where that's going. And so I could totally see them going to some online version for AP. I doubt it's going to be from home. I think it's just still too risky I think for a long time it's going to be sort of under supervision, like under some type of center or your school can offer it or kind of thing. I mean, there are opportunities for kids to take AP exams for schools that don't offer it. There's a whole opportunity out there. Trust me, AP wants to make the money. They make it available. So yeah, so I don't see you don't have to worry about not having a place to take it. And
I'm not worried. I'm not worried at all. But
I know parents are you brought back when you brought that up, like you brought back a 15-year-old migraine for me though. Like I was freaking out because I was in admissions and helping Susan with college counseling as an adjunct counselor, and I'm traveling all around, and I was like, we're gonna get killed, by parents that are going to feel like your kids are at a competitive disadvantage, and also they're not going to come in with as much scholarship money on credits. And I really thought it was going to be just brutal. But it was really like sort of when you think a hurricane's coming and it never comes, like you're hearing the news is coming and blah, blah, blah. It's kind of what it ended up being. It was just a little drizzle.
Right. And I think someone made the point that if you're just worried about credits, you can do CLEP. And, as we know.
Somebody brought that up?
Yeah. It wasn't me. I was going to bring it up, but somebody else did. I think
I'm impressed that somebody knew CLEP. They must be listening to our podcast.
And he
CLEP
said,
is the big secret.
Schools on that list and so, and then, like you can do modern states and you can, do it for free. So, I mean, there are options just to get the credit. Now that probably won't help you with the, impressing the admissions officers kind of situation, but.
I mean, one thing admission officers, now this is especially true of people that do holistic admissions, they really do a great job of reading you in the context of your school. They really do. And so once they know that this is a school that's not offering them, like you can take this to the bank, like the college list will be very similar over the next few years than it was before. And when they said that they surveyed and they, all but 2 schools said that's true. I mean, we did the same thing. Susan did a survey as well with our schools, before we did it and to get their feedback. And like, that's true. I know it sounds weird, but like it really actually is true. They don't need AP. Now, I'll tell you what they're going to want to know, and which are your harder classes. They're not going to want this pure homogeneous, all classes are the same.
Right.
Like you do yourself a disservice if you don't let them know these are the more challenging classes and the more rigorous classes.
Right.
And then they'll just look at your grades in those harder classes, and they're good with that. Especially from the school. You're at a school that's got as good a reputation as any school in the state. So, I mean, it's a harder thing for schools that don't have a strong reputation to do. But when you're coming from a school with a really good reputation, like they have a past track record of knowing how graduates have done from your school, like you're really going to be fine. Trust me. I've been where you were 15 years ago.
I'm not worried about it at all. And I saw Lily take APs and helped her study for APs. And I did not think that was necessarily the highest quality education a person could have. It did, like she could graduate a semester early because of it, but, so that's nice, I guess. But, I definitely think there's advantages to not having it, but it's just interesting when we're talking about the test. Is test optional really test optional, or is it, kind of test recommended?
People don't like change. I mean, the one thing that I will tell you is you have a great faculty at your school. Just for those of you listeners, the school that Lisa's kids are at is a school that we seriously consider too. When we moved from Pennsylvania, we looked at the Raleigh market, Charlotte market, and the Atlanta market. And if we were going to your market, you're at the school that we were going to go to if my kids got in. So, I know your school, and it's a very fantastic school. So People don't like change. Wait till you see what they come up with. They'll come up with some really, really good.
Oh, I'm sure they're going to be amazing. Even like when Lily was in elementary school, this was before the Common Core, and her teachers would kind of get to teach things however they wanted. And it was great because they were teaching in their area of strength. And then the Common Core came, and I've definitely noticed, like with Sonia, I think the quality of the education went down because the teachers were hamstrung, ham-tied. I don't know. They were limited. Let's say.
I know what you're saying, but you're actually using a really, really good example. Like that's a great example. AP is more like Common Core.
Right.
Once again, you're coming from a school with really good teachers, strong students, high standards. They're fine, and a great reputation. Like I would be a little more concerned with just a brand new school with no track record making that decision because there's not a track record of credibility.
Right. And certainly like the public schools, let's say you're in a more rural area, but you offer some APs. I mean, that really, I think, gives your students a boost. And I wouldn't recommend getting rid of that for them.
Yeah, there's certainly true that there's certain schools that AP does give us that imprimatur of rigor, and it can help, give some credibility. But other schools don't need that. They've already established that. And so this is something that's, works better for schools that do have rigor and that have a reputation.
Yeah. On the other hand, my kids are probably going to be doing test prep again. So
life.
By time. There you go.
Awesome. Well, good conversation, Lisa, as always.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
All right, friends. Hopefully you enjoyed the first part of my interview with Milyon Truelove as he took a look at why U.S. News and Reed were incompatible. And they said, go pound sand. We're not contributing and participating in your rankings anymore. Timing of that was fantastic, right when the Yale-Harvard announcement came out. In part two, Milyon goes into more reasons why you can't take rankings at face values and all the ways in which rankings are manipulated. Listen and enjoy. So let's go back to Reed. So, because you've seen Reed be anywhere from the top 10 to the 90s, right? How much do you feel from your experience that movement in the rankings impacts your job and your role? I'll preface this. I asked this question to another school recently, and they said, I think it's important we stay in the top 30. If we were to drop out of the top 30, I think it would impact us. And so what are your thoughts on that?
I think, we are the alternative solution for folks who actively don't believe, for whom the rankings are not a value.
Right.
And so I was at Stuyvesant in New York, and I mentioned that we don't participate in rankings, and the parents started to applaud.
Yeah.
And I just thought, because there's probably so much pressure on them.
There is.
To really look at places.
Stuyvesant, I'd say, places like Stuyvesant are just incredible. The kids, the number of kids that are all aiming at the same schools.
Exactly. And for those parents to say, like, what a relief, for me was just really telling. So what I'll say is it probably has more impact on me. At the end of the year, I don't pull up a spreadsheet, look at my average test score, or look at, how many people I'm admitting. I can make decisions that make sense.
Sure.
Even when we're looking at test scores, I could admit someone despite their test scores if I knew they would do well. And I did.
Right.
And so it gives you a certain type of student focus. And I think it comes through in your behaviors, how you talk about enrollment, how you're transparent. What I say to students is, if you want to get in, I'm going to teach you what you have to do to make the most competitive application possible. So no tricks. We're going to give you the plan.
You're bringing up so many good points. Do you think that you meaning Reed, do you think that you may benefit in a way maybe some other schools don't, because this is almost like a niche you have now? Mm-hmm. You're the maverick that bucked the system. And in a crowded field out there, if you can be first mover, like you can now attract. I'm sure you hear every year from people that say, we're drawn to read because of what you did on the rankings. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, there's truth to that. And a lot, like I said earlier, because we're in the top 100 and maintain that position, it gives us a unique position. If we're joined by other schools, I think they too would have that unique position. But I'll be really frank to you. When any school has had a student in their associate dean's office who's saying, I no longer want to be a student here, they don't come to that office meeting and say, it's because your school isn't really number 32 on USVs.
Sure.
That's never a reason why they're choosing a different place.
Right.
Why do I say that? Because the ranking has no permanence in their decision-making process. Because they make decisions on other things if it feels right. If they can imagine themselves being their senior year and being happy and they like that version of themselves. And so while the conversation will always bring people to the table, I think what it is a loose indication of our values and where we're placing our emphasis. And Stuck, I'll be honest, that's my issue with the rankings, is that it forces everyone to chase after the same criteria. And that means students aren't looking at your mission statement or your vision statement to find out what their experience is like. They're looking at a number, which will not be relatable once they become a first-year student. As soon as they set foot on campus and sleep in that bed, that number has no place in their college experience. I think people need to come up with their own list and figure out what their values are and what's important to them. That's the stuff they're going to remember when they're a student on campus.
Yeah, no. And I mean, Ed Fisk puts it really well when he talks about this. It's not about where's the school ranked overall, but what about for you personally, for your criteria of what you're looking for? How does that align?
Absolutely.
So I know that reads back in the news again because there's a book that's come out and it's getting a lot of attention. In fact, we have recommended it on the podcast.
Nice.
Called Breaking Ranks: How the Ranking Industry Rules Higher Education and What to Do About It. Love that subtitle, by the way. I like that.
Isn't it?
I mean, because it hits the rule. It hits the rules higher education, and then also what to do about it. And by Cullen Diver, who you mentioned earlier. And so, what is the message of the book, and what are a few things you feel that can be done to push back on the power of the rankings?
Well, the thing I appreciate about it is there's a so what. And I think so often when we get into this sort of rankings echo tunnel, we're like evil, bad, evil, bad. And the truth of it is most of the things that US News is looking at are important things. Right. You want to graduate early or in 4 years. You want faculty to be well resourced. What we all argue is that the proportions are off. Are they different? Or some of these should not be criteria? Or why does this get 5%? Why does this get 25%? And as a result, robs students of really important decision-making power, which is what are your values and what's important to you? And I think Colin also makes this point really nicely because many of these things that we see as sort of college academic admission virtues have an unfortunate high correlation with wealth, with status. And as a result, the criteria sort of feeds itself. And it then abandons students who may not be positioned as well as others. And so test scores, we all know this, test scores are highly correlated to income, so on and so forth.
Sure.
They're a big part of these rankings.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 277 is a particular video on a YouTube channel. This YouTube channel is done by Melissa Ford, and the name of the channel is Damsel of Success. How clever is that? It's one I subscribe to personally, but it's a particular video, and we'll put the link in the show notes for you. It's on the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan, better known as PAYE or PAYE, pay-as-you-earn. So I got to get in the weeds a little bit here, but this is what's known as an income-driven repayment plan. So who is this for? If you know somebody who graduates from college and they have more college debt than their salary, there's a very good chance they should be on an income-driven repayment plan. And there's two that are out there, one called Repay, which we'll talk about at another time, and this one, PAYE, pay as you earn. Why would you want to be on this income-driven repayment plan? Well, because there's a very good chance that you will end up paying less on an income-driven repayment plan than you would on a standard repayment plan. Standard repayment plan requires you to pay your loan back in 10 years with the entire loan. An income-driven repayment plan adjusts your monthly payment to your income. All right. And if after 20 years the balance is not paid off, then the debt is forgiven. Now there's some conditions in there. You need to check with your loan servicer once a year to adjust your payment to your income. And the loans need to be federal direct loans, not private loans. And there's some other conditions. I'm not going to get in the weeds too much. I just want you to watch this 20-minute video if you're in this situation, because it could save you potentially over $100,000. I mean, there's a lot of people that go to med school, dental school, law school that have hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, or even just grad school, because you can borrow through the Grad PLUS loan system up to the cost of attendance of the school. If you've got $140,000 of loans and you're making $70,000 a year, you're not going to be able to afford a standard repayment, that could be $1,600 a month. You're not. But with a PAYE program, your payment might be $400 a month. So it looks at your adjustable gross income, and it also subtracts some money that's linked to the basic standard of living, the cost of living, the poverty level, 150% of the poverty level. Subtracts that after your adjusted gross, comes up with a number that's within budget. And so if you're going to stay, now if you're going to starting at 70 and you're going to be making 300 or 400 because maybe you're a doctor and a surgeon and you're in residency, then, it may or may not make sense. But this video will help you know whether the PAYE or the pay as you earn repayment plan makes sense for you to manage your debt and to have it forgiven. And you don't have to work for a nonprofit like you do for public service loan forgiveness. That's very important. You can be in a for-profit environment and still use this income-driven plan to have your debt forgiven. So I feel like I'm getting in the weeds here, but just watch the video and pass it on to anybody you know that has more college debt than their income, and especially if they're not working in a nonprofit. And that's our recommended resource for episode 277. I'll now return to my interview with Milyon Truelove from Reed College. Another thing, several things about test scores. If they're not a big part even of the official rankings, they're also one of the ways the public ranks too.
Yes.
Just when I've always said I've got a theory. There's four big things from my experience that I see families looking at. One is test scores, one is rankings, one is acceptance rate.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is just kind of when you sort of throw the name out to your peers, like how they react, they all kind of calibrate to say, oh, this is a really good school. Oh,
right.
But you can do better,
Yeah.
This kind of thing creates in the mind of people, which really is highly correlated, unfortunately, to selectivity.
Yeah.
And
the dinner party conversation, right?
Correct. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. And so that stuff is real. And I mean, you even have said a couple of times, like you're in the top 100. And so that might afford you an ability to be deemed as, okay, they're credible. They're up there and they're still in the top 4% or whatever of higher ed. And so, because there are people that say, okay, as long as you're ranked pretty high, I don't care where you are. And so you pass the muster test there. Are there things that have helped with the rankings? Because, whatever gets inspected gets expected, right? So
I like that.
Are there things where, okay, maybe it is good for schools to pay more attention here? And this is a controversial one, but I'll throw one out as an example. Well, I'll throw a couple out. One is first gen Pell Grant recipients. Now, one of my criticisms in U.S. News is they haven't really factored diversity much
into their assessment. But, we know that it's arbitrary anyway, all this assignment of numbers. But I've seen in the last 10, 15 years, more schools trying to increase their first gen and their Pell Grant numbers. And I think that's partly a response to the rankings. Now, not always U.S. News, because like Washington Monthly tends to there's a lot of competitors out there. Well, like Washington Monthly tends to put a big emphasis on that sort of thing. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think I'm sorry, this is going to be a little bit longer answer than I want to give, but
it's all right. We got time.
So I think there's two things. I'm gonna start with the test scores because this is sort of in full disclosure. I love the four things you mentioned for ways that people perceive selectivity. I think you're spot on. I've not heard it articulated that well. And I'll tell you, one of my biases that I was living with was the fact that we weren't involved in the rankings. I knew that the fact that our test score was 30th highest in the nation was a way that other people would evaluate and perceive our selectivity. And so going test blind, I had to really wrestle with that because I had always said, we say yes despite the test score, because that was true. So low test score, I would still say yes, but I still needed some sort of beacon to folks. Sure. And so when we went test blind, it was a real risk. And I have never looked back. Our ability to perceive how students are doing in their school is great. Students still submit test scores so we can evaluate and see if we'll stick with this decision. But, I'm saying a very bold thing for us. This is something that I'll just say was our bias because, I'm not perfect. But what I'll also say is with the rankings, one of the reasons why they required a certain proportion of students to have test scores was because when you go test optional, your average test score tends to go up.
Sure.
So they didn't want schools just doing this so they could gain the rankings and all of a sudden shoot up through the system. So they're trying to incorporate some integrity. I don't know that it worked like that, but you can argue either way. Pell Grant. Yes, more people are paying attention to Pell. I actually think that has less to do with U.S. News and World Report than some of the newer rankings that come out that rank social mobility.
Correct.
Alumni pay a lot of attention to that.
Yeah.
And Washington Monthly does a good job of really looking at some of the qualitative factors and telling people what the data is. You might not agree with the rankings, but you see the data.
Sure.
And so I think they've done a really good job. I think what is happening, unfortunately, as a result, is the Pell number is decided by the feds. They say this is your expected family income or contribution. If you're at this number and below your Pell, $1 up and more, you're not Pell. Students who are $1 up are getting pinged. And so if you break down the data and look at admission rates, I feel that students that are just outside of that Pell criteria are having a harder time gaining admission.
Yeah.
This is anecdotal. It's not quantitative, but I think there has been a bounce back in other ways, which are unfortunate because those students are still needy students.
Sure. And I think it's a good for our listeners to extrapolate, like the stuff that gets published ends up getting to become a little bit more of a priority. Right.
As you said, it gets expected.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So if having strong Pell numbers is a way of touting my socioeconomic diversity, then I might put more of an emphasis on that, and it catches my attention. If a kid is Pell and we want them, that could become a little bit of a thumb on the scale. But that person that's just above that, not only do I not get credit for that, you're going to take a lot of my aid budget up.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's real talk, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I thought about when we were talking about the rankings, it's tough, is it's why it's so complex. Graduation rates. We all think that's important. And everybody wants to have the best graduation rate they can, the best 4-year, 5-year, 6-year, all that. But this also can have ramifications. Do you take the kid who's traveled very far with the resources they've had, but maybe it's a very dysfunctional family, and they're much more of a risk to graduate than that double doctor kid is.
Right.
And so that's a tough one too, because like in one way, graduation rates, well, I'd rather you look at something like graduation rates than some of the other criteria. But at the same time, there's still such a bias toward income and education of the family.
It's sort of interesting you say that. And graduation rates are the one place where test scores have been helpful. test scores do a better job of predicting the likeliness of a student to graduate in 4 years than the likeliness for them to be successful in school. And so, that sort of is an interesting way to look at this tool, which also, like you said, also correlates with wealth. There's so much there. Something that's sort of interesting that we're starting to pay attention to is the strength of schedule available at that school. So in other words, not every school can offer, let's just say, advanced placement or IB.
Sure.
But if a student is taking the most rigorous schedule at their school, we're starting to see that has some correlation with their likeliness to graduate in 4 years. And so there's alternative tools that are available within the student's grip that's not really related to income. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. It may be related to income, but it's less likely to be related to income than test scores.
Awesome. Well, Milyon, this has been great.
And this Monday, we will have Arlene Cash, a veteran of 5 decades of admissions, who will discuss an array of topics with Mark regarding admissions strategies.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blacks. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.